right, well, welcome back. I'm Gail Carpenter, and I'm talking to you again about milk quality, this time focusing on outbreak investigation. So I want to start our discussion today by asking, how do you know if there's a problem in your herd? So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. It's going to vary a little bit from farm to farm, and so it's really important to stay attuned to what is normal for your farm so that you can identify whether or not there's something that's varying from the normal for you. This can vary greatly based on how many goats you're milking, what systems you're milking in, your housing systems, and your overall farm goals. So it's really important to be attuned to what's going on in your herd and what your goals are there. So we want producers to stay attuned to the bulk tank components, such as somatic cell count, before you have a regulatory violation. We talked in the previous video that regulatory violation is usually over 1 million or 1.5 million, depending on if you're selling grade A or not. But we really want to make sure that you're paying attention to what's going on in your bulk tank over time and what the trends are in your bulk tank before you have any sort of violation so that you can potentially identify when a problem has started. Also pay attention to things like visual changes. Pay attention to the milk as it's being milked from the goats and pay attention to what's going on, again, that's varying from your normal in your herd, because there is no one size fits all. So there's a couple different measurements that we can use. The first one is somatic cell count. We spent a lot of time in the previous video talking about somatic cell count. But just to reiterate, SCC is good for monitoring changes in udder health. It doesn't have direct health impacts like bacterial count does. By that, I'm referring to bacteria that are in the milk for human consumption. So somatic cell count or somatic cells are not toxic or in any way pathogenic to consumers. We can also use SPC or standard plate count. This is a milk culturing measurement, and it depends on having live bacteria in the milk. There's also a tool called Bactiscan that measures for bacteria, and this is going to count all bacteria live or dead. So Bactiscan counts are always going to be higher than SPC or standard plate counts. But we're interested in two things when we're looking at milk quality issues. The first is somatic cell count, which I've spent a lot of time talking about already, but the other is the actual bacterial count in the milk. Now, if you have identified that you have an issue in your herd, it's time to start looking at what's causing the mastitis or what's causing the failure in milk quality. I think it's important to recognize that there's different ways to describe mastitis. So we can describe it, generally speaking, by duration, symptoms, and transmission. So if an infection is chronic, or that means that it lasts for an extended period of time, sometimes even weeks or months. Acute is going to be a shorter term infection. So an acute infection may not necessarily be caught if you're testing your milk every 30 days on DHI, because you might have seen a goat with a spike that is immediately resolved or quickly resolved. Chronic, on the other hand, is going to be an infection that lasts for an extended period of time. We can also describe mastitis based on whether or not it's symptomatic. So clinical mastitis is going to be one where you can actually see physical symptoms. So you might notice abnormalities in the milk. You might notice a fever even, or a hard quarter, or a quarter that's painful or swollen to the touch. Subclinical mastitis often carries no symptoms, and so you might not even recognize that the goat is carrying an infection if you're not testing your milk. Clinical mastitis is relatively uncommon in goats, but we do see a lot of goats that have subclinical mastitis, as I discussed in the previous video. Another way that we can define mastitis is by its mode of transmission. So environmental mastitis is going to be the mastitis that the animal gets from the environment. So it might be from her bedding, or it might be from her where she's out in the pasture, where she's laying down. Environmental mastitis is going to be out where the animal is housed and living. Contagious mastitis, on the other hand, is spread through milking equipment. So it's spread from goat to goat in the parlor or by the equipment that you're milking the goat with. So if you have identified that you have an issue with milk quality, the first step would be to do a bulk tank culture. And this is going to be to answer a simple yes or no question, first and foremost, which is, do you have Staph aureus? Staph aureus is a contagious pathogen. And so if you have this in your herd, you're going to want to know which goats are the ones that are carrying it. Identify which ones are infected. And you're going to either want to milk those goats last so that you have a chance to clean the equipment before the next goats come into the parlor for the next milking. Or you might have the choice to sell them first. Depending on the economics of your situation, you might decide to cull those animals. It's a good idea to culture your bulk tank before your farm has some sort of issue, just so that you understand, again, what is normal for your herd and what that you have at a baseline level. To troubleshoot equipment, if you identify that you have an issue with the equipment, there's some things to keep in mind. So some staph species may be from equipment not being cleaned properly. So they may not necessarily be from the goat or spread from goat to goat, but they may be culturing and growing at the equipment level itself. So these bacteria will often take advantages of rough surfaces. So if you have cracks or any sort of issues with your tubing, for example, surfaces that are kind of worn and rough, that aren't cleaned properly or regularly, bacteria can tend to grow on these surfaces and cause problems in the bulk tank as well as potentially with the animal. These staph may cause a biofilm, which you can actually feel sometimes as like a slimy or mucousy buildup inside of a tube or piece of equipment. And it's resistant. These biofilms are resistant to detergents, so they might not necessarily be cleaned unless you scrub them manually. So it's important to keep in mind that we don't want these to build up because they can cause issues with our bulk tank bacterial counts. Additionally, we have other issues that we can troubleshoot within a herd, and I discussed these in more detail in the previous video, but just to review, we want to avoid contamination in the pen. So we want to make sure these animals have a clean and dry environment, and that is, again, to avoid any sort of incidence of that environmental mastitis that I talked about earlier. Using best practices in the parlor, that's a good way to avoid our contagious mastitises, as well as some of the environmental mastitis and keep that from spreading from goat to goat. Making sure that we're monitoring milking equipment, making sure that we're changing inflations regularly, as well as monitoring the cleanliness of that equipment and making sure that we're cleaning it regularly. We want to make sure that we have feed available after milking. As I mentioned, I want to make sure that these goats are standing and eating before they go lie down. That gives the teat end a chance to close and provides natural protection against incoming pathogens. And then again, making sure that we chill our milk quickly, especially those large volumes of milk, and also making sure that our temperature is consistent throughout the day. You can use a data logger or some sort of temperature monitor to actually test this and see if you have large fluctuations in milk temperature throughout the day. But we want to make sure that our milk is chilled quickly and stays cold to prevent any of those bacterial growth.